and welcome to another episode of what I'm going to call for now the Freelance Society Podcast with me, Christian Stephen.
And this is Dylan Roberts.
We've been covering war together and separately for about, I think it's 8 years, I think is what it is, maybe a little longer, in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Gaza, Somalia, and more. And, it's interesting. I think one of the things that the long-form conversational format is good for is being able to go into more in-depth topics that don't usually get discussed, and I think surrounding especially a huge byproduct of what we do that we don't talk about. A lot of even our friends, family, and the people who see our work and read about what we do don't know a lot of the effects it has long after stories have been published. And I think, what's interesting is it's something that you and I haven't really discussed with each other in depth before either. And it's the largest subject of what is PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. I know for my part, when I first got into this and covering war, obviously I knew to some extent that, there would be a possibility of seeing terrible things and covering terrible things, but I don't think I knew the extent of how it would affect me personally.
Yeah. I think for me, I never had anything personally do something to me. We almost died and there was very close calls.
Multiple times.
Yeah. But nothing like kidnapped or been injured, the hardest
more my
one.
thing.
Yeah. For me, it was something that after 6+ years of constantly seeing intense imagery in a way, not just with eyes, but, sight and smell, and just over and over and over again, nonstop, it eventually comes up and just hits you all at one time. And more when you're back, at least for me, in the U.S., where your brain is literally processing, and it's processing without even you kind of catching up to it.
The subconscious, yeah.
So for me personally, it hit me in a way where I thought I was invincible to it, just because nothing physically happened to me. I didn't get injured. I wasn't kidnapped, but I saw things that were very close to me. In a weird way, a lot of it was children for some reason.
That's not weird. That's like
Yeah, I've seen many adults, and
I see what you mean, yeah.
But just thinking about it, for some reason, kids in my line of work, I was exposed to it in a really awful way.
Yeah.
For you, going into it when you first started, and now, what would you tell your young self now, knowing what you went through? Some advice for it.
Well, that's such an interesting thing. I know for where I'm at today, I wouldn't go back and change it, because, I know the way I went through it, the way I coped with a lot of the things that, I saw, the way I coped with it was extremely unhealthy. But I know that it also made me appreciate the healthier ways that I deal with it now. I think, I should preface by saying, for anyone listening, if you have, history with post-traumatic stress disorder or trauma or anything like that, just watch out for anything that may bring up anything untoward that you may not want to hear. But, we're going to be discussing our version of it. I think for me, definitely, going into it, I knew there would be some extreme things that I would see, but I wasn't prepared for... You can know something's coming at you, but until it actually happens, you're not prepared for how you physically or mentally respond to it. I think a good example of this is... when we were at the Sinjar front line.
Yeah.
And we were in the armored car heading towards the front line, and we had the that mortar that hit direct
Right.
hit on the vehicle that didn't go off. It was a dud, and that's interesting in the way of like it wasn't something like some of the other things that was traumatic or it didn't explode or anything, but just something so odd and something so strange in the way of we should have died
Yeah.
at that point. And I know when I was asking another journalist about it, he was like, "Well, you need to reckon with the fact that you sort of owe the universe a death in some way." And I know, like when we got to the hotel room that night, I went to the bathroom while you were sleeping, and I was just having panic attack after panic attack, and I was so taken aback by why this was happening because it wasn't like the other times, like in Syria. When I was kidnapped on the way out,
Right.
and there was a few days of torture with that, it was a completely different thing of how the mind was reacting to something that should have happened but didn't. And that I think that was interesting.
Yeah, and some backstory on the Sinjar. This was at the time in 2015 where there was no coalition help.
Yeah.
It was the Kurds fighting against ISIS. And at that time, ISIS held majority of all the city of Sinjar, and we were basically coming up through the mountain and then kind of on the valleys where the city is, and we got to about 30 meters within ISIS, and so sniper fire, armor, but the base that we're at, going towards the front line, you have to get in an armored vehicle, and you basically are exposed to the ISIS fighters, and that was probably one of our first kind of moments where we're like, wow, this is
real.
This is real.
This is real. Yeah.
And you kind of have, at least for me, I was just so focused, and not letting any emotion, just what's the objective and everything. And I remember, coming back to the hotel, I just went to sleep.
Yeah.
I just kind of like, F it, I'm not going to think about it.
Yeah. You were FaceTiming with your dogs.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It was just, I pretended it was some kind of like game, I guess, in a way.
That's interesting. It's a coping mechanism, to try and compartmentalize in the mind.
Right, and I've always been just a person anyway, like, okay, let's just get through it, why do we have to...
I think that's why it's so interesting that it hit you when you came home. Like, I know I want to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I would say it really hit me the end of 2017 and then all of 2018. The last front line part was in Mosul, July 3rd, 2017, and I haven't done anything since then. I've gone back to Iraq, but just normal stuff, nothing, crazy. And at that time, it was relatively calm. ISIS had been, taken back, quote unquote.
Right. Defeated.
Defeated.
For
in
those
a way.
Listening, I'm using extremely sarcastic air quotes.
Right. But I haven't done any combat type filming since July 3rd, 2017. Yeah. And since then I think about it every single day. There's not a day I don't think about it.
What was that first week like when you stopped? When you came back?
Yeah, back to the US.
Yeah.
I think mentally I was just like, I'm ready. I'm done. I started hating the world. People that would just ask me questions like at the bars or anything like that, ask me how it was.
Let me interject. This is after one of the trips where we'd basically seen the mass graves where they pulled out. Like, what was it? I think it was a 6-month-old who'd been beheaded by ISIS.
Yeah, that was before. That was that was early in the year of that same year. So I was going to Iraq nonstop, covering full Mosul operation.
And I was already a full-blown alcoholic by this point.
Yeah.
So I had stopped going because I was just in the bottom of a bar somewhere in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wasn't at quite to that point. But I think when I came back in 2017 and kind of was like, I'm done, then it all kind of hit me. And then even in 2018, when we had a film at Sundance, man, that was probably the lowest time ever.
I barely remember
Yeah.
that festival. Yeah. I do remember you had that. I remember you had that moment.
I was just mad at the world.
Yeah.
And
we
had a film.
We were surrounded by all these pretty people who had their films about certain things. And look, we love cinema. You know, we were just in.
It's not their fault.
It's not their fault at all. And this is
Yeah.
another aspect of it. It's, you know, we were angry at the world for not understanding sort of the pain we were in from having covered these things, but also we were, you know, surrounded by, you know, these celebrities who had their films there, and no one understood where we were coming from and what we'd just seen, you know, and what the film we were there with was truly about.
Yeah, and for me, I had to really take time, and I tried therapy and didn't work. Like,
I didn't know you went to therapy.
I went for 2 days.
You just went to sign the papers.
It was just a guy that I found online. I was
Craigslist
living,
therapy?
yeah, pretty much, man. And not the therapist's fault or anything, but it was a guy who obviously I've never been. But it was probably for me, I just didn't have it. I was just doing it just to like make me
say
feel
that
better.
You've done it, yeah.
Yeah.
I think people have to specialize in that too. I went to a therapist once after we'd gone to these places. At the end of the therapy session, you know what he said? He said, "Well, I can't be your shrink, but we should hang out." And now to this day, he's one of my best friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I still don't do therapy, but there are people like my wife, and I think each person copes with it differently.
Totally.
I don't think there's a correct way. I believe there is a wrong way, just not talking about it and hold it in. And that's
one of the wrong
that
ways,
was
yeah.
my biggest problems, was I just wasn't expressing it, and it just catches up with you. And just little things like, I used to love going out and being crowds and see concerts and hanging out with friends. And I'm getting better at that. But it's always like, what's the phrase? Fight Yes.
Yeah, it's the lizard brain.
Right. And I still have that.
Yeah.
It's better now, but I never liked going out into crowds, you know, public places. And I used to not be like that. I used to go to the party and go hang out and everything.
You were a frat boy.
I was, but it wasn't like a traditional frat.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Do you want to tell everyone what your nickname in college was?
No. But let's just say I did some fun things. But I think I'm one of the few that did this kind of job that was married. Like when we did Sinjar, it was our first year of marriage.
Yeah. Which,
And-
bless your sweet wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For you, what was it like going to these places where a lot of it you're single?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely had more of the devil may care aspect. In that way, I think I thankfully had a lot of hubris knocked out of me, because I know I went into a lot of our trips with not so much a feeling of invincibility, but in a way of like, well, I don't care if I die. You know, I had the longest time where I was like, well, I'll be dead before I'm 30, so I might as well do some really interesting things.
One of the scariest things I remember, we were just in a hotel and in Erbil in Iraq, and like I think the next day we were planning a frontline trip, and you chugged a bottle of like Skyed vodka or something like that.
Yeah. Is that when I was up to like 5 downstairs?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, for the listener, basically my reaction to it was, because I got into...
Was I supposed to say that? I don't know.
It's totally fine.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's the name brand of the vodka?
Yeah.
It wasn't Sky Vodka. I don't drink that shit.
Oh, okay.
It definitely wasn't. No, but absolutely, it was one of the ways that I coped with it was because I had this example of a lot of the other foreign correspondents, which was you were hard drinking, hard smoking, going into the firefight, you know. And the thing is, I really took that to heart. But what I didn't realize was that when I would come back from covering some of the horrible stuff that we did, was that I would have a drink, and then I would have another. And then the thing is, it would just carry on until I was up to like 4 a.m. And it became the only way that I could reconcile with the things that I was feeling was to soak it in booze.
Yeah.
But the thing is that when I went home then afterwards, and I would have night terrors and flashbacks, my instinct was to go for the drink. And it became that it wasn't so much a coping mechanism, it became a necessity to get through the day.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is, you see it in films and it's like, oh, the edgy, cool alcoholic who's got a problem, but still has that like vampiric look. What you don't get is that good-looking people are being paid to put on makeup and act like an alcoholic. Being an alcoholic is way different because it's paralyzing, and it's emotionally stunting, but it's also, it just brings out the very worst part of you. That's true, but it also keeps wounds that need to be healed away from the resolution and help that they so desperately need. And I think it also became the thing of, because I did it at such a young age and I was exposed to all of this. I mean, it really took, it really sped up after Syria. For when I went into Syria for Welcome to Aleppo, and then on the way out of Syria, I was captured and then held and tortured for 4 days.
Yeah.
And then managed to get out. And then I remember after that, that's when I was just drinking every day.
Yeah.
Every day at, didn't matter what time it was. And it became a fact of, I had a great excuse to drink. And that was part of the problem too. It was like, oh, that's Christian. He drinks a lot, but it also helped that I was charming when I drank, and I didn't drive or kill anyone or anything like that. But it became a thing of like, oh,
He doesn't know how to drive.
at all. And that's,
Which is a good thing.
we saved many lives.
Yeah.
But it was a case of, I had an excuse to drink. But the one thing that I didn't realize was that the very reason that I loved the job that we were doing and being able to do that thing well was taken away and robbed from me by alcohol.
Yeah.
Because basically by covering up the pain I was feeling with booze, it also meant that I couldn't feel the feelings that were integral to actually finding and telling a good story.
Yeah. I was lucky. I know for a lot of journalists, conflict journalists who do this job, they gravitate to alcohol or drugs or women,
Because alcohol, drugs, and women are amazing.
Yeah. And for me, it was never like that, I would say. But when I do drink past my limit, I am a way different person.
Yeah.
It's better now,
Yeah,
but
yeah. Well, if you look at it this way, there was like before and after. Like I remember, here's two examples. I mean, the first example was we got drunk and you asked me to be your best man.
oh yeah.
So that was a good version. And then like cut to years later, and it was just sort of like, oh, we're a mess.
Yeah.
Like we're an absolute mess.
It wasn't cool.
No.
Well, even just we would go to the front lines, go back to Erbil,
Yeah.
and just get blitz drunk.
Yep.
And then wake up 6 a.m,
Work out a hangover and do it again.
go back to it again, and repeat.
Yeah.
On top of like trying to get published and get a story and filming it and talking to our families
And trying to hold it together.
and hold it together. So yeah, I don't know there is a correct way of doing it.
Sure, shit isn't the way we did it. But the nice thing is coming out the other side from that is an important one. I think we're gonna have to cut that out.
No, it's fine.
I think one of the most interesting aspects of it is how it's sort of glorified in a weird way. The sort of romanticism of the job and the romanticism of seeing like you go to all these crazy places and see these terrible things, but it's still human beings who are there.
I don't know if PTSD has a side effect of like when people ask me, so what's Iraq like?
Yeah.
Just as
What do
a
you
pop-up conversation.
Yeah.
I think if someone were to ask me about anything else, it would be totally fine for me to go in like, oh yeah. If someone were to ask me, who's your favorite football team, I would go all day. But if someone asked me...
It's the Patriots, right?
Yeah, no. Dallas Cowboys all the way. Can we please be sponsored by them? But if someone asked me, what's war like or what's Iraq like? Have you almost died? I've literally been asked that question.
Yeah,
have
I
you
get
almost
that.
died
I get
before?
that all the time. Yeah.
And it's not their fault.
Yeah.
They ask it. It's just I find it weird that I mentally then kind of put on a defense.
Totally, I do the same. But the thing is, how can you explain 8 years of like we've had?
So do you think that's a sign of PTSD?
I think in many ways, but I think like how many friends have we had die?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like how many people do we know who've either been killed by ISIS or kidnapped or killed in Africa? There's or committed suicide. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Just from the collateral damage of the places we've been in, the stories we covered. So I think if somebody asks you, have you almost died? The only thing you can do is sort of close down a little bit and try and put an answer, because it's really for their sake as well. Because you don't want to sit them down and be like, let me tell you how I really feel about this.
And to be fair, not all those countries, it's not like when you land in the airport.
Yeah, totally.
And it's like guns blazing.
We've been to some great nightclubs in war zones.
Right. Exactly. I go to this karaoke bar. Yeah. Shout out to all my friends in Erbil. I miss them. But I've
What's up, Amar?
Yeah, Amar. Miss you. But some of my just best times hanging out with friends has been in those countries. And I think that needs to be better explained, at least for our jobs. Yeah. It's like, why do we only focus when we're covering conflict? We have to focus on the really bad side, which is that's our job, and we have to do that. Yeah. But we shut out the also good times.
Totally. I mean, the thing is, like, a country with conflict is still a country, right. And it still has people in it who aren't all just trying to kill each other. That just isn't how it works. But the thing is, that's sort of what fits into a narrative. But going back to, if somebody asks you, what is war like? Let me ask you, what is war like to you? How would you explain that?
War is a bitch. That's what,
war is a bitch.
That's my quote.
Yeah.
I think war is something that it's the hardest to explain. Mm-hmm. It's no matter what photo or what video you show or even talk about it, you're never going to fully understand it unless you've been there. And it's not like a video game or movie type of feel. Yeah. It's just kind of it's just happening, and you're almost there just along for the ride in a way, which is weird because you can always just back out. You could just get back in the car and drive back to the safe place,
which we've never done.
But you're just kind of like just programmed
because you want to see what happens next as well
to keep going.
Yeah. Well, you're programmed to see where will this lead. You know what I mean?
Did you ever feel like you put the danger above for like getting a story? Was that ever like, how would you say?
I remember one moment really clearly, this is like 8, but one moment I remember really clearly was when I snuck under the border from Turkey into Syria. Shout out to Turkey, still banned for life.
Yeah.
Snuck under the border.
They have your passport still.
They do have my passport and my dignity.
Yeah.
Snuck under the Turkish border into Syria and was picked up by a jeep by the rebels on the other side.
Yeah.
And then we drove for a mile. It was like 2 miles from the border to Aleppo, which is basically the road that gets
bombed
by Assad constantly if you're going in and out. And I remember when I got in the car, like I had the option right there to get back out of the car and go back to the border and say, I've made a terrible mistake. Please let me back in.
Yeah.
But I remember getting in the Jeep and going, okay, here we go. This is it. And I knew from that moment until I got back that it would either be completely fine or I would be dead. And obviously those are there's a massive difference between those two things, but I felt completely at peace with the fact of I've made the decision now to go into this because I need to find out what's going on in the city. Because this is at a time when no foreign journalists were inside Aleppo. And if they were getting kidnapped and killed by ISIS.
Right.
So basically I got in the Jeep and was ducked under the back while we were going through ISIS checkpoints and Jabhat al-Nusra and all of those. And basically just like saying to myself, well, let's see what happens. And I think that's the time that sticks out to me definitely of I'm doing something now that cannot be changed. Whatever happens next will always have happened, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but you end up coming out with the first VR 360 film in a war zone.
Yeah.
But it took a lot from you.
If the question was it worth it?
Yeah.
Absolutely not. No, it wasn't worth it. Am I glad I did it? Yeah, absolutely. Because the repercussions of going on that trip and being captured and tortured for that film.
Yeah, I remember that. I was like sending you just messages, code words to making sure. And then
shake and bake.
Luckily, our mutual friend contacted me and say, you're going to be okay. Yeah. At least you're going to be alive.
Yeah.
But it's going to take some time for you to get your head straight.
Yeah, totally. And it took about 3 years.
Yeah.
It was just a slow fall into the abyss after that.
Yeah.
But I think, Yeah, it's such an interesting one. I think the emotional twisting that comes from having survived war, because I know a lot of guys, a lot of conflict journalists, they just stay in it because it's only when you come out of it that you see how fucked up it is.
Yeah.
And so it's almost better to stay in the comfort of the darkness, because when you try and come back to normal, sort of what's known as civilian life, that's when it's so overtly clear that what you've been through does not fit in, and it's really difficult to communicate that too.
Yeah. I remember when I was in Mosul and had that experience where we had like 6 kids get blown up in front of us, and we rode in an ambulance, and we were just putting them in the ambulance, and all of them but one.
I remember being really worried about you.
Yeah,
when you
all
told
but
me about
one died on the way to the hospital, and I remember that was one of the first times where I was like, I don't feel like a journalist anymore.
No.
So, yeah, it's everyone has their limits and breaking points. Each person is different when it comes to coping with this. But I'm the same. I don't think I wouldn't change it.
Yeah.
I would have done the same.
Yeah. That's such an interesting point, though. That sort of moment where you're looking at like the pile of bodies in front of you, and you're like, "What am I doing? What am I doing here?" Like, like the world doesn't like. Obviously, there's an argument that the world needs to see this, but what am I doing here? This is like beyond.
Yeah, and putting pressure on your family.
Totally.
Like, I'm running through. Any moment, my leg could be blown off or get sniped, and I'm running through IEDs, and who knows what I'm stepping over.
Totally.
And my one step could be my last, and I have a wife and amazing family back home.
Yeah.
You know,
and you look at what all your friends are up to, living normal lives, and you go, "Why am I in like the ruins of the mosque where the leader of ISIS declared that the forming of a caliphate?" It's sort of like. I should be job hunting for something normal.
Right. Yeah. It's I think I always thought, like, what if my brother went and did this?
Yeah, I can't imagine. Yeah.
I think I would be more stressed out. I would be very stressed out.
Yeah. In a way, my worry was that, what we do is selfish. You know what I mean? In a way of sort of like, we're putting our families through hell and back just so we can do this. But then that's combated by the fact of, we have seen our stories affect, I like to think, real change and, change people's opinions of certain parts of the world.
Yeah. I think just like, kind of like in closing, I do miss it's been some time since we, been on the action. You've done really great job of just, staying healthy and fighting it. I still feel like I'm still figuring out, but I'm doing better.
Yeah.
But it's going to be with us forever, no matter what.
Well, I think that's the whole thing. It's sort of, can you look at the devil in the corner and say, you know what, like, instead of just freaking everyone out, why don't you come in for a coffee? Because if it's going to be with you forever, you might as well make friends with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's good.
Yeah. We'll see what the future holds. Well, that's it.
That's the end.